My name's Damon. I'm 32, and if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that family can surprise you in ways that make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty and decency. I never thought I'd be writing a post like this, but here I am, sitting in the hospital room at 3 a.m., holding my daughter's tiny hand while she sleeps, and thinking about how my own father managed to make the worst possible situation about my brother. A week ago, my daughter, Lily, came down with a serious infection that had her admitted overnight. She's 5, so this was terrifying enough, and I've been trying to be as present as possible, pacing the waiting room, running her fluids, and doing everything to keep her comfortable. I thought my dad would understand. I was wrong. It all started with a call at around 10:30 p.m. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I saw it was my dad. I hesitated for a split second, because the last thing I wanted was a lecture, but I answered anyway. Damon, his voice started, sharp and clipped as always. Your brother's promotion dinner is tonight. It starts at 7. Don't be late again. I blinked at the clock. 7 p.m. was hours ago. Dad? I started, but he cut me off. You always find an excuse when it's not about you. This is important, Damon. You need to show support. I felt my chest tighten. I swallowed hard and said as calmly as I could, Dad, I can't leave her side. She's in the hospital. She's really sick. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then his voice, cool and dismissive. Excuses, Damon. Always excuses. You're making this about you again. I didn't argue. I just hung up. Quietly. That call should have ended it. But it didn't. It never does with my dad. It lingered in my mind as I sat there watching Lily breathe evenly in her sleep, the little beep of the heart monitor keeping time with my racing thoughts. I could feel the weight of my father's judgment pressing down, the way he always manages to make you feel guilty for prioritizing anyone else. My brother, Tyler, is 5 years older than me, and growing up, it felt like Dad treated him like a golden son, though he would never call him that outright. But it was obvious in the way Dad laughed at his jokes, defended his mistakes, and celebrated his achievements while my successes were downplayed, ignored, or met with pointed critique. And now, even here, with my daughter in the hospital bed next to me, it was about Tyler. Always Tyler. I spent the next few hours pacing the corridor outside the pediatric ward, my mind spinning with all the conversations that never happened, all the times I swallowed my feelings to avoid conflict, all the silent dinners where Dad made subtle digs and Tyler beamed like he owned the world. I thought about leaving the hospital for a second. I even checked the time. The dinner would have been half over by now. Part of me, the part that still feared my father's disapproval, wanted to text an apology, a reassurance that I would somehow make it. But then I looked at Lily's tiny hand, her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, and I realized something I've always known but seldom admitted. My daughter's well-being mattered more than a promotion dinner or my father's opinion. By the time the night shift nurse came in to check vitals, I'd made up my mind not to answer Dad again that night. But the tension didn't fade. Every text notification made me flinch. Every missed call made my stomach knot. Even when I tried to settle into the chair next to Lily's bed, my thoughts kept drifting back to the call, to Dad's smug sense of superiority, to Tyler's assumed entitlement. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a one-off moment. This was a pattern. My father had perfected it over decades, turning every situation into a stage for his favorites, every achievement into a tool for comparison, every crisis into a test of obedience. And I wasn't about to play his game this time, not while Lily's life was in the balance. Around 2 a.m., I dozed off in the chair, only to wake to the sound of my phone vibrating insistently on the counter. It was Dad again. My stomach dropped. I debated ignoring it. Honestly, part of me wanted to set the phone down and pretend it didn't exist, but curiosity and, I'll admit, a twisted sense of dread got the better of me. The voicemail was brief, clipped, and dripping with that familiar, condescending tone. Damon, I hope you're awake. Tyler called. He said you didn't make it. This isn't just about Lily. You need to learn priorities. Call me. My hands shook as I listened. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, to scream, to tell him to leave us alone, but I stayed silent. I just breathed, listening to Lily's soft snore, feeling the enormity of the gulf between how I parented and how my father viewed the world. By morning, exhaustion had set in, but so had a simmering sense of indignation. Lily, surprisingly alert for someone who had been running a fever, stirred, and mumbled something that made my heart stop. "Dad, Grandpa came here last night." My blood ran cold. I hadn't expected anyone from my family to even know she was in the hospital, let alone to think it was acceptable to show up unannounced. Panic, fury, and disbelief all collided at once. I asked her calmly, trying to mask the fear rising in my chest. "Grandpa, he came here? Last night." She nodded, blinking up at me. He brought Tyler with him. They wanted to see me." I felt my stomach drop to my knees. My mind raced, trying to process what this meant. How could they even think this was okay? Lily had been vulnerable, in pain, scared, and somehow, they thought their presence was a gift, a display of concern, a chance to show me once again that I was failing in their eyes. I wanted to call the hospital, to confront them, to make sure nothing had gone wrong. But the thought of protecting my daughter from the confrontation was stronger. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to think. I had to plan. They had crossed a line, one that I hadn't even realized existed until that moment. Sitting there, holding Lily's hand as she finally woke and smiled weakly at me, I realized something crucial. My father wasn't just being difficult. He was manipulative. He thrived on control, on making me feel small, on keeping me in my lane while he paraded Tyler around like the standard I could never meet. And this time, he had overstepped. This wasn't just about a dinner or a missed call. This was about boundaries, about protecting the person I loved more than anything in the world, and about finally standing up to the toxic dynamics that had haunted me for years. I didn't have a plan yet. I didn't even know exactly what I was going to do. But I knew one thing. This wasn't over. And when the time came, they were going to realize that I wasn't just Damon, the compliant son who could be guilt or shamed into submission. I was a father now, and Lily came first. Always. The morning after Dad and Tyler showed up at the hospital felt like a trap I hadn't seen coming. I spent the early hours pacing the corridor again, trying to make sense of how they could be so cruelly oblivious to what Lily and I were going through. The nurse hadn't mentioned any visitors, and the hospital's policy was clear. You had to sign in at the desk. Somehow, my father had managed to bend the rules, charm the staff, or just ignore the rules entirely. Part of me was terrified to imagine what had actually happened in my absence. But I didn't find out then. The first thing Lily said was enough to cut me open. She wasn't hurt physically, thank God, but her voice trembled in a way that made my heart squeeze. They brought Tyler and ice cream," she said, hugging her tiny blanket. He told me I'd be fine, and that Grandpa said you should leave for a while." My stomach lurched. My own father had tried to manipulate a 5-year-old, a sick, scared 5-year-old, into thinking her dad, me, wasn't enough, that she needed to listen to Grandpa. I forced a smile and rubbed her hair, telling her it was okay, that I was right there, and that nothing they said mattered. But inside, a storm was building. I had been patient for years. I had swallowed insult after insult, joke after joke, snide remark after snide remark. I had kept my composure, stayed polite, and tried to reason with them like a grown adult. And yet, here we were, at the hospital, and they had no respect for boundaries at all. The day dragged on. Lily's fever spiked again, and I stayed glued to her bedside, barely allowing myself to eat or drink. Every notification on my phone made me flinch. I knew it would be Dad. He always called or texted when I was in the middle of something, just to remind me how inconvenient my existence was for him. My brother didn't bother texting. He relied on Dad to do the dirty work. By mid-afternoon, I received the inevitable, a text from Dad, short and sharp. "Damon, I spoke with the hospital. They said Tyler and I were polite. I don't understand why you're making this harder than it needs to be. You need to stop overreacting. It's not about you." I stared at the message for a long time. I could feel my jaw tightening. The sheer audacity of it made my chest ache. "Not about me," I muttered under my breath. "This is about my daughter, Dad. This is about Lily." But texting back wasn't enough. I had to protect her, and every minute that passed, my father's presence in our lives was a reminder that my family wasn't on my side. They were aligned against me, against the people who mattered most. I decided to call Tyler. Maybe, just maybe, he would understand. Maybe he would see reason. When he picked up, his voice was light, almost teasing. "Hey, Damon, did Dad tell you I came by? How's Lily doing?" I froze. He sounded happy, proud, even, like it was some sort of achievement. Tyler, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You came to see her? You and Dad. He chuckled, and I could hear the smirk in his tone. Yeah, man. We just wanted to check in. She's lucky to have us, you know. Maybe you should have been a little more appreciative instead of whatever this is you're doing. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My own brother, my family, was framing me as the unreasonable one, as the villain. I felt a heat rising in my chest, a combination of anger, fear, and helplessness that I hadn't experienced in years. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand that this wasn't a game. But Lily's hand on mine stopped me. She looked up with wide, trusting eyes, and I realized I couldn't lose my temper here. Not now. Not ever. The next few days were a blur. My father escalated every small thing into a test of my devotion, or rather, a critique of my supposed lack of it. Every time I tried to leave Lily for a quick shower or to grab a bite, I got texts. You're selfish. You always put yourself first. Tyler called. He's disappointed you didn't attend the dinner. Your priorities are skewed, Damon. Every message felt like a blade, cutting through the exhaustion and fear that had been my constant companions. I started keeping the phone on silent, only checking for hospital updates, but the damage was done. Every text, every call, every voicemail was a reminder that my family had no intention of respecting boundaries. Then came the day that finally broke me. It was a Wednesday evening. Lily was awake, fever mostly gone, smiling weakly but with more energy than I'd seen in days. I decided to finally step out for 10 minutes to grab a coffee from the cafeteria. I left her side, promising I'd be right back. I walked down the hall, feeling the weight of the week pressing on me, and when I returned, my worst fear had materialized. Lily was sitting up in bed, clutching a stuffed animal, and her eyes were wide. Dad, Grandpa left something for me. My stomach dropped. I froze mid-step. Something? I asked carefully. She nodded. A card and a little box. Grandpa said Tyler wanted me to have it because I was sick. He said it would make me feel better. I felt bile rise in my throat. I opened the card slowly. Inside, in Dad's neat, controlling handwriting, were words that felt like a punch in the gut. Damon, I hope this helps Lily see what real support looks like. Love, Grandpa and Tyler. And inside the little box, a toy that Tyler had picked, with a small note attached, from your big brother, who knows best. I felt the world tilt. They hadn't just barged in. They'd actively tried to undermine me, to create a wedge between my daughter and me, to make her feel grateful for the people who had caused her fear and confusion. My hands shook as I held the card. I wanted to throw it, rip it, burn it, and scream at the top of my lungs. But I didn't, because I realized something terrifying. They thought this was love. They thought they were right. And my daughter, bless her heart, didn't understand the manipulation. She only understood that Grandpa and Tyler had done something nice. I sat down on the edge of her bed, holding her tiny hand, and forced myself to take a deep breath. I needed to calm down, to think, to plan my next move. But the rage, the betrayal, and the exhaustion were all swirling together, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. My family had crossed a line. They had shown that my daughter's vulnerability was an opportunity for their control, and it wasn't just Dad anymore. Tyler was complicit, enjoying the sense of superiority, relishing the chaos. Over the next few days, the tension only mounted. Every phone call from my father became sharper, every message more critical. Tyler started sending texts directly to Lily's tablet, little notes and digital drawings, always ending with his signature smirk emoji. I knew he was doing it to provoke a reaction, to make me feel powerless. And it worked at first. I felt trapped, exhausted, and completely alone. But that feeling didn't last. It lit a fire in me, a determination I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about a hospital visit anymore. This was about taking control of the narrative, about protecting my daughter from people who had spent her whole life subtly trying to undermine me. By the end of the week, I realized something terrifying. My father and brother weren't going to stop. Every attempt to set boundaries had failed. Every polite explanation, every calm conversation had been met with condescension, guilt-tripping, or outright manipulation. They had proven, without a doubt, that they valued their pride, appearances, and entitlement more than my daughter's safety and well-being. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The betrayal wasn't subtle anymore. It was bold, in my face, and it cut deeper than anything I'd experienced in my adult life. Sitting beside Lily that night, I held her hand tightly. She drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the week, and I realized that something fundamental had changed. I wasn't just a son being pushed around by his father. I wasn't just a younger brother being compared to someone who could do no wrong. I was a father. And fathers don't let people manipulate or terrorize their children, not when they're this small, this vulnerable, this innocent. I stayed awake long after she fell asleep, going over every conversation, every text, every manipulation, every moment I'd swallowed in silence. I realized that what they had done wasn't just disrespectful. It was strategic, calculated, and it had to be met with a response that matched the gravity of their actions. I didn't know what that response looked like yet, but I knew one thing. They had just lit a fire that wouldn't go out quietly. For the first time in years, I felt the full weight of what it meant to stand up to my father and my brother. And I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't be the same Damon who answered Dad's calls with politeness or tried to rationalize Tyler's smug behavior. Something had shifted in me. Something had snapped. And Lily, my daughter, my responsibility, my heart, would be the reason they would finally understand that their entitlement, manipulation, and cruelty would no longer go unchallenged. After that week, everything changed, though not immediately in ways anyone would notice. On the surface, I was still Damon, the exhausted dad, the patient son, the brother who tried to stay calm and polite. But inside, I felt hollowed out, as if every act of manipulation, every guilt trip, every subtle attack from my father and Tyler had stripped away layers of confidence and trust one didn't realize I had. I started questioning myself constantly. Was I really overreacting? Was I failing as a parent? Did I deserve this constant scrutiny? The answer was obvious to anyone looking from the outside, but when you're trapped in the cycle of their behavior, it's almost impossible to think clearly. The first few days after Lily came home were the hardest. Hospital bills were stacking up, my work schedule was chaotic, and every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. I kept imagining Dad and Tyler showing up at our doorstep unannounced, trying to manipulate Lily or guilt me again. I even considered changing my phone number, but I didn't have the mental energy to do more than survive the day-to-day. I started walking around the neighborhood more, just long, endless loops to clear my head. It wasn't productive, but it gave me some breathing room from the constant tension that hung over my apartment like a storm cloud. At work, I began to notice something I hadn't before. I was competent, capable, and creative, but I had spent so much of my life trying to appease Dad, trying to match Tyler, that I hadn't allowed myself to take risks, to truly aim for what I wanted. Slowly, I started taking small steps, tweaks in my projects, volunteering for tasks that pushed me outside my comfort zone. It wasn't dramatic, and no one applauded me, but each success was like a quiet spark in the dark. It reminded me that I wasn't powerless, that my worth wasn't defined by how much my father criticized me or how often Tyler's smug smile made me doubt myself. At home, I focused on Lily. I'd watch her play, laugh, and gradually regain the energy that had been sapped by illness. And I started noticing the little ways she mirrored the manipulations she'd experienced. She would sometimes ask, almost offhandedly, "Dad, do you think Grandpa is mad at me?" And each time, I had to remind her, gently but firmly, that she was safe, loved, and never responsible for anyone else's feelings. Protecting her became my anchor. I realized that I couldn't change my father or brother overnight, but I could control what I allowed into our lives, and I could be the model of stability, kindness, and fairness that they had never shown me. Still, there were moments when the old feelings crept back in: helplessness, rage, and grief. One night, I sat in Lily's room long after she fell asleep, scrolling through old photos of family gatherings. In every picture, Dad was smiling at Tyler, proud, approving, while I was either in the background or half smiling, aware of the subtle ways I had been excluded. I felt the weight of years of favoritism, condescension, and manipulation, and for a long moment, I let myself cry. It wasn't about Tyler. He was a product of the same environment, but about my father and the way he had taught me that my worth was conditional, constantly tested, never fully recognized. That night, as I cleaned up the photos and put my phone aside, I realized something. I had hit rock bottom emotionally, but hitting rock bottom also meant there was nowhere to go but up. The clarity that came in that quiet moment was simple yet profound. I didn't need my father's approval anymore. I didn't need Tyler's recognition. I needed to focus on myself, on Lily, and on building a life where our happiness and stability were paramount. And for the first time in decades, I felt a small but real sense of power. Not the kind that comes from controlling others, like Dad tried to do, but the kind that comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone else define it. I began making deliberate changes. First, I took steps to limit my father's and Tyler's access. I changed the way notifications worked on my phone, set boundaries on what I shared publicly about Lily, and made it clear, without confrontation, that visits or calls would happen only on my terms. When Dad sent long-winded texts about how I was failing as a son, I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I wrote drafts, deleted them, and waited until I could answer calmly, if at all. The power dynamic was shifting subtly, and even that small reclaiming of agency felt like a triumph. Next, I started investing more in my career. I enrolled in an online course related to my field that I'd been too intimidated to attempt before, and I quietly started building a small portfolio of freelance work on the side. Every assignment completed, every client satisfied, reinforced the idea that I was capable on my own terms. And secretly, I started thinking about ways I could create independence from my family, not just emotionally, but financially. Tyler's promotion dinners and Dad's smug sense of superiority didn't have to dictate my self-worth or the opportunities one pursued. But perhaps the most important part of the rebuilding process was emotional. I started journaling, not the vague, day-to-day type, but a detailed account of interactions with Dad and Tyler, the subtle manipulations, the moments of disrespect. It felt cathartic, almost surgical, to write down exactly what had happened, in real time, without letting their narrative distort my memory. Each entry strengthened my sense of clarity and conviction. I could see patterns, predict moves, and slowly begin to think about what real consequences might look like if I ever chose to confront them. Despite the progress, the weight of what they had done to Lily lingered. Every time I saw her clutch a stuffed animal or smile nervously at a notification, I remembered the card and toy Grandpa and Tyler had left behind. That image became a driving force. I couldn't undo what they'd done, but I could make sure it never happened again, and eventually, I could make sure they faced the repercussions of crossing those boundaries so egregiously. That thought became both my anchor and my secret motivation. Gradually, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I walked taller, spoke more decisively, and started to push back against small intrusions before they escalated. I stopped apologizing for needing space, for prioritizing Lily, for asserting boundaries. It was uncomfortable at first, like any muscle being exercised after years of disuse, but the strength built steadily, quietly. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And each step forward, each act of self-preservation, felt like a quiet reclamation of power from a family that had spent decades trying to take it from me. At the same time, I kept an eye on my father and Tyler, observing without engaging. Every text, every social media post, every conversation I overheard at family events became data. I didn't act rashly. I didn't call out their behavior publicly. I simply collected evidence of patterns, habits, and arrogance that would later matter if, and when, I decided to assert myself fully. There was a satisfaction in this quiet vigilance, a sense that the scales were slowly beginning to balance, even if only in my mind. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, nights when exhaustion and anger mingled so completely that I felt on the verge of collapse. But I kept coming back to Lily. Every laugh, every hug, every "I love you, Dad," whispered as she drifted to sleep reminded me why I couldn't give in. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding, quietly but intentionally, cultivating strength that no one could undermine. By the end of the month, the change was tangible. I had a small but growing portfolio of work, stronger boundaries with my family, and a sense of self-worth that was no longer contingent on approval from my father or brother. More importantly, I had clarity. This was no longer just about enduring their antics or surviving their favoritism. This was about preparing for a confrontation, about reclaiming respect, and about ensuring that Lily would never be used as a pawn in their games again. And somewhere deep down, behind the exhaustion and the lingering anger, a seed of anticipation had been planted. I wasn't just going to endure them anymore. One day, I would make them understand, without yelling, without drama, without letting my emotions betray me. Exactly what it meant to cross the line with me and my daughter. But for now, I kept it quiet. I rebuilt in silence. I grew in patience. I observed. I waited. And in the shadows of my father's arrogance and Tyler's smugness, I began to plot. The shift from surviving to scheming felt almost criminal in how natural it came. Once I decided I was done being the passive one, things accelerated in a way that surprised me. Not because I suddenly became dramatic, but because the distractions and excuses that had padded my life for years melted away. I started treating the problem like a project because I knew myself. Give me a plan, a timeline, and I'll dismantle whatever's in front of me piece by piece. I didn't want revenge that looked like a tantrum. I wanted something surgical, calm, and undeniable. I wanted to make my father and Tyler understand, without melodrama, that they had crossed a line no one crossed with me and my daughter. Step 1 was documentation. I'd already been journaling, but now I became meticulous. Every call, text, voicemail, and unexpected visit went into a log with dates and times. I took photos of the card and toy Grandpa left at the hospital and saved screenshots of Tyler's texts, including the patronizing ones he sent to Lily's tablet. I wrote down witnesses, nurses who'd been polite to my father because the hospital staff always tried to be pleasant, the receptionist who had signed them in, the neighbor who'd seen Dad's car in the lot. It felt petty at first, like keeping receipts for emotions, but the act of recording gave me structure and power. If you can prove a pattern, you can call it out without sounding like a paranoid son. At work, I repurposed the quiet courage I'd been developing. I met with a co-worker I trusted, Marta, who'd become more than a colleague over the last 2 years. She listened without flinching when I told her what happened and didn't offer cliches or platitudes. Instead, she asked practical questions, and when I mentioned that Dad had skirted hospital rules, she suggested we look into the hospital's visitor logs and policies. Marta happened to have a cousin who worked in medical administration, and she offered to look into how strict their sign-in process really was and whether unauthorized visitors were common. It felt like a small thing, but alliances matter. You don't have to do hard things alone. I reached out quietly to family members who might be less aligned with Dad's worldview. My Aunt Susan, Dad's sister, had always been cordial but distant, and she often played neutral at family events. When I called her, I was careful. I didn't unload everything in one breath. I framed things as concerns, more curious than accusatory. Do you remember when Grandpa showed up at the hospital last week? I'm trying to understand how they got in without signing in. I'm not trying to make trouble, Aunt Susan. I just want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Her pause was telling, and then she admitted she'd heard Dad mention the visit to a cousin and that he sounded proud. She didn't want to get involved, but she also didn't defend them. That lukewarm neutrality was useful. It meant I could count on at least one person who wouldn't lie to protect Dad. I also spoke with Lily's pediatrician. I framed it as a check-in, not a complaint, and described the visit in clinical terms. Unexpected visitors, a worried child, possible confusion about consent. Dr. Myers listened, asked a few questions about what I'd observed, and then did something I hadn't expected. She told me the hospital actually had a policy about advocating for patients' privacy and consent, and she offered to make a note in Lily's chart that visitors should be pre-approved by me. She said it like it was routine, but to me, it felt like a line drawn in the sand. Small procedural changes can have huge consequences when enforced, and the thought of my father being politely refused entrance to a pediatric room made me feel steadier than I had in weeks. Meanwhile, I started quietly tightening boundaries. I updated my phone settings, so calls from my father went straight to voicemail unless I answered. I blocked Tyler from Lily's tablet and set up parental controls that only allowed approved contacts. I changed passwords and tightened our front door routines. Each small measure reduced the chances of a surprise visit. It wasn't dramatic revenge, just sensible containment. But containment felt like victory on the days when my anxiety threatened to curl my stomach into knots. Financial security became part of the plan too. Dad had always liked to throw his voice about responsibility and success, and Tyler rode that narrative like a comfortable coat. I recognized that if things escalated legally, if they tried to claim visitation rights or spin the narrative at family gatherings, I needed leverage. I hired an attorney for a consultation, not because I intended to sue, but because knowledge is leverage. The attorney, calm, pragmatic, and uninterested in drama. Laid out things I could do. Document harassment, demand no contact if necessary, and in extreme cases, petition for restraining orders if their behavior became threatening. Hearing legal language applied to my private hurt made it concrete and less emotional. It wasn't about punishment. It was about setting enforceable boundaries that people who were used to getting what they wanted would actually respect. As I tightened my defenses, I also started to rebuild our public image quietly. My social media was pared down. Less family photos, more about daily life with Lily, and quieter posts that emphasized stability and joy rather than conflict. I wanted to control the narrative so that if Dad tried to spin things to relatives or on social media, there was already a counter-narrative people could see. Lily was safe, loved, and thriving under my care. I reached out to a couple of close friends and asked them to be observers. If Dad or Tyler tried to gaslight others in our circle, I wanted people who'd seen the truth to speak up. Friends who could corroborate the timeline, who could say, "Nope, Damon wasn't missing from that dinner. He was at the hospital," mattered a lot more than I'd expected. But planning wasn't just external. I prepared myself mentally, rehearsing calm responses to the things Dad said best when he wanted to wound. I practiced saying no. I practiced shutting down conversations with steel-clad politeness. I rehearsed telling him, "You're not welcome here unless you respect our rules," and not crumbling when he called me selfish. The person I was building inside was steady, adult, and immovable. That was the whole point. The best revenge wouldn't be drama. It would be the quiet confidence of a man who had been bruised but refused to be defined by those bruises. There was also a tactical element that felt almost tactical in the spy movie sense: information. I started compiling a timeline of family events, public posts, and dates. Times Tyler had exaggerated his role in family achievements, moments Dad had publicly praised and privately belittled me, and I stored it offline. Names, dates, witnesses, receipts. It wasn't vindictive, it was procedural. If the time came to expose hypocrisy, I wanted facts, not he said, she said. I set up a small folder on a hard drive titled D. It felt childish to use a single letter, but it made me smile. There's power in organization. Allies multiplied in subtle ways. A nurse I'd met at the hospital, soft-spoken, tired, and honest, admitted she'd been annoyed that someone had sidestepped the signing-in process. She didn't know my father, and didn't care, but she recognized when a parent's rights were being disregarded. She told me she'd be willing to confirm when she'd last seen Grandpa in the ward. Marta's cousin found a procedural loophole Dad likely exploited. Aunt Susan sent me a text offering neutral support. Dr. Myers put a note in Lily's chart. My attorney explained the kind of evidence that mattered in family court. Piece by piece, systems were aligning in ways that favored a parent who prioritized consent and safety. Yet for all the preparation, what I wanted most was a moment that didn't feel like triumph at someone's expense. More like a revelation where they'd look at their own reflection and see the thinness of the armor they'd worn for decades. I wanted them to feel embarrassed, not exposed, to understand, not to be humiliated. That was the difference between me and Dad. He loved dominance. I wanted restoration, of dignity for Lily, of boundaries for myself, and, if possible, a mirror held up to him so he could maybe, just maybe, see what he'd become. And then a late afternoon phone call changed the shape of everything. It wasn't from Dad or Tyler. It was from the hospital administrator, a woman named Claire who'd only ever sounded bureaucratic when I'd spoken with her before. This time, she had an edge to her voice that made me sit up straight. "Mr. Hayes," she asked, "I need to speak with you about a complaint that was filed last week. It's regarding unauthorized visitors to a pediatric patient. We've reviewed security footage and sign-in records." My heart began to thud in my throat, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes?" I asked. "I'm listening." There was a pause, a breath filled with weight. "We have footage showing a gray sedan in the staff lot at 11:02 p.m. last Tuesday. The vehicle ID matches a car registered to your father. The footage shows two adults entering the pediatric corridor." My mouth went dry. I felt all the careful work I'd been doing coalesce into a single axis. This was the opening I'd been preparing for, the procedural evidence meeting the human witnesses. Claire continued, "We're opening an inquiry to determine how those visitors gained access without authorization. We can place a hold on future visitor access pending the outcome." The administrator's words hung in the air like a verdict in waiting. I swallowed. The part of me that wanted immediate, explosive confrontation tensed. But the planning part, the patient Damon, took over. "Thank you," I said. "Please proceed. For Lily's safety, I'd like to request that no one be allowed to visit without my explicit approval." Claire's voice softened just a fraction. "We'll note that in her chart, Mr. Hayes. Expect a formal call within a week." The line clicked, and for a moment the apartment was too quiet. I looked down at my hands, calloused from work, steady from late-night walks, stained with worry, and something like calm acceptance spread through me. The system had responded in the way I'd hoped, quietly, by the book, and with documentation to back it up. It meant Dad's maneuvers might finally have consequences beyond family gossip. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Lily asleep upstairs and a map of my father's patterns spread in front of me. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no gloating. There was only a keen, careful satisfaction, like the feeling just before the first domino falls. I had gathered evidence, allies, and procedure. I had tightened our defenses, and I had a legal plan in place. I'd become the kind of man who created structure where there had been chaos. But plans, I'd learned, are only as strong as the unknown you can't anticipate. I'd built a fortress of facts, but my father was a force who understood social performance better than I did. He knew how to play pity, how to spin lies with a smile. I felt ready, but underneath the readiness was a knot of fear. What if he anticipated my moves? What if he doubled down, sued for visitation, or weaponized family against us in ways the system couldn't easily handle? The answer would come sooner than I expected. 2 days later, as I was drafting a calm, non-accusatory email to Dad telling him, in firm terms, that unapproved visits were no longer acceptable, I noticed a comment on a family group chat I wasn't even a part of. It was Aunt Susan's name, but the message attached linked to an article about a local charity gala. Tyler was listed as a guest speaker. The gala ticket page displayed a photo of Dad in a suit, smiling, with a brief blurb about family values. The performance was in motion. Their public faces were immaculate, and their control network was tight. I closed my laptop and leaned back. The pieces were moving. They were already practicing damage control, stepping into the spotlight where they looked best. I realized then that if I wanted them to falter, I couldn't just rely on policy and patience. I needed timing. I needed a stage where their image mattered, and where mine, quietly, could undermine them without seeming petty. I began to watch calendars, Tyler's public events, Dad's scheduled family gatherings, upcoming holidays. There was an opening coming up, a neighborhood charity event where my father had been invited to speak. It was small, local, and the sort of place where appearances counted. It was also, crucially, public. If something were to be revealed there, not in a scream but in an undeniable correction supported by facts, the fallout would be visible to people who mattered to them, colleagues, neighbors, and the very social circle that Dad used to airbrush his narrative. I folded my hands and looked at the quiet apartment. Lily's stuffed animals lined her bed, innocent witnesses to everything. The plan was falling into place, but a plan needs a spark. I could feel the moment coming, a hinge waiting to swing. I tuned every sense to anticipation, every strategy to patience. I'd spent a long time rebuilding. Now it was time to wait for the right place to test the structure. And then, 2 nights before the gala, I got an unexpected text from an unknown number. "We should talk. I have something you need to see." The message included a time, a location, and a single instruction: bring proof. My stomach dropped in a way that was half hope and half apprehension. The clock was ticking. The stage was set. The next move would change everything. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse pick up, and realized I'd finally reached the edge of the cliff I'd been circling for months. I could step back and let the system handle them, or I could step forward with the quiet, patient plan I'd built, and risk everything for the chance they would finally understand what they'd done. I pocketed my phone, looked up at the ceiling, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to smile. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I was no longer the boy who answered every call. I was Damon, and I was ready. The unknown text felt like the first audible click in a sequence I'd been building toward, and as I walked to Lily's room to check on her, I knew the next few days would tell me whether all the careful groundwork had been enough. The night of the gala arrived, and I felt the kind of focused calm that only comes after months of preparation. Lily was asleep upstairs, tucked in with her favorite blanket, and I had everything I needed in a small, discreet folder. Copies of hospital logs, photos of the toy and card, screenshots of Tyler's texts, notes from the nurses and Dr. Myers, and my own meticulously maintained journal of every interaction. I didn't carry it as a weapon. It was my insurance, a record of truth ready to be presented at the precise moment. The goal wasn't humiliation for humiliation's sake. It was undeniable clarity, a public reflection of their entitlement that couldn't be ignored. I arrived at the venue early, dressed simply, unassuming, with my demeanor steady. The charity gala was intimate, held in a local community center, its guests a mix of neighbors, small business owners, and a few local journalists covering the event. Dad and Tyler were already there, Dad in his usual tailored suit, projecting that smug, confident energy he always relied on. Tyler, ever the charming sidekick, was smiling at every familiar face, nodding and pretending to know more than he did about philanthropy. They were performing the image they wanted the world to see. Well-groomed, generous, respectable. It was almost laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. I lingered at the periphery, observing, timing, and waiting for the right moment. My pulse was calm, steady. I had rehearsed this in my mind countless times. The trick wasn't confrontation. The trick was context. If I presented the evidence correctly, in front of people who respected procedure and truth, their performance would collapse without me ever raising my voice. The moment arrived when Dad was about to give a short speech. Tyler stood beside him, grinning, subtly basking in the reflected attention of the crowd. Dad began his usual spiel about family, community, and values, his voice smooth, practiced, confident. He paused for applause, and the audience responded politely. That was when I stepped forward. Not disruptively, not loudly. Just forward, with Lily's hospital folder tucked under my arm, and a calm, professional tone that instantly caught the attention of anyone listening. "Excuse me," I said, projecting clearly. "I have something to share that directly relates to the topic you're discussing." The polite murmur of the crowd shifted toward me. Dad's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. Tyler stiffened. "My name is Damon Hayes," I continued, "and I'm here because some values my father and brother claim to represent, responsibility, care, and respect for family, haven't been upheld in practice." I saw a few people lean in, eyebrows raising. The journalists were already alert. My daughter was hospitalized recently. During her stay, my father and brother visited without permission and attempted to manipulate her in ways that were not only inappropriate, but against hospital policy. I have documentation to verify everything. I placed the folder on a nearby table, opened it, and methodically began showing the evidence. Security footage timestamps, hospital sign-in logs, photos of the card and toy left behind, and screenshots of the text Tyler had sent to my daughter's tablet. Each piece was factual, concise, and impossible to dispute. I spoke clearly, unemotionally, letting the documentation speak for itself. The audience's reaction was immediate but measured. People whispered, some gasped quietly, and a few pulled out phones to discreetly record. Dad's face, once confident, hardened into something brittle. Tyler's charm faltered. He stammered a weak protest, but it sounded hollow against the weight of proof. I maintained eye contact with the crowd, not with them, letting them witness the discrepancy between the public image Dad and Tyler had curated and the reality I presented. "What I'm showing is not an accusation for attention or drama," I added, keeping my voice even. "It's the record of events that occurred while my daughter was vulnerable, and it demonstrates the exact opposite of the values being celebrated here tonight. My father and brother may have influence, but influence does not exempt anyone from accountability." By now, Dad was pale, his speech forgotten. Tyler's face was tight, his smile gone. Several audience members exchanged looks, neighbors, friends, and local business owners who had known Dad for years. The subtle network of credibility he had relied on to shield himself was collapsing. A woman who ran a local charity leaned toward me, whispering, "I had no idea. I'll make sure the board sees this." I nodded politely, holding my calm as the evidence settled over the room like a quiet storm. I didn't stop there. I called attention to procedural safeguards and professional witnesses. Dr. Myers, Lily's pediatrician, and several hospital staff have verified these incidents. Hospital policy requires parental consent for visits, and my father's actions violated these procedures. We can confirm the dates and details with the staff if anyone has doubts. A few nurses and administrators, who were present in the audience by coincidence, nodded subtly, further validating the documentation. Dad finally spoke, voice strained. "Damon, this is a private family matter," I interrupted gently but firmly. "It is private in the sense that it involves my daughter, but when actions cross the line into manipulation, disregard for consent, and exposure of a minor to inappropriate influence, it becomes public because it affects the community we're standing in right now. I'm not here to shame. I'm here to clarify. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." The room was silent. Tyler opened his mouth, then closed it. Dad's hands trembled slightly, which I noticed because I'd been watching him for years and could tell the difference between performance and fear. And at that moment, I felt the culmination of all my preparation. The months of logging, securing allies, tightening boundaries, gathering procedural proof, it all came together here, in front of witnesses whose respect Dad had long taken for granted. The fallout was immediate. A few people approached Dad quietly, asking clarifying questions, and his usual smooth answers didn't suffice. Tyler muttered something about misunderstanding, but it sounded absurd and defensive. I stood calmly, letting the evidence speak, while quietly observing the crumbling facade I'd endured for decades. I could see the shift in perception, the subtle but irreversible erosion of credibility. Their entitlement, once a silent force, was now exposed to scrutiny. Later, the gala organizers pulled me aside. "Thank you for sharing that," one said. "We were not aware of these incidents. We'll make sure the board and our members understand exactly what happened. Your daughter's well-being comes first, and no one will challenge that here." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a private victory. It was a systemic one. Policies, reputation, and procedure were aligned with truth now, and my father and brother were the ones on the defensive. By the time the event ended, Dad and Tyler were quiet, subdued, and visibly shaken. They didn't confront me further. The public evidence was undeniable, and any attempt to spin it would have seemed transparent and petty. As I drove home that night, the weight on my chest lifted. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't stooped to melodrama. I had executed a plan with precision, calm, and strategy. And more importantly, I had protected my daughter, preserved her innocence, and reclaimed my own authority as her father. When I got home, Lily was awake, reading a story. I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "We did it, kiddo. You're safe now, and nothing like this will happen again." She smiled sleepily, the trust in her gaze absolute. I realized then that every step, every moment of doubt, every long walk, every careful preparation had been worth it. The quiet rebuilding, the planning, the patience had all culminated in a moment where justice wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. The next day, I received a call from Aunt Susan, and then a few neighbors who had attended the gala, quietly confirming what they'd witnessed. Dad didn't call. Tyler didn't text. For once, silence spoke volumes. They had been unmasked, not through anger, not through shouting, but through deliberate, calm, patient truth. Sitting at the kitchen table later, Lily asleep upstairs, I reflected on the months of fear, frustration, and preparation. I had transformed from a reactive son into a strategic, unflappable father. I had protected my daughter, exposed the hypocrisy, and reclaimed my dignity. And for the first time, I felt unshakable. Some might call it revenge. I call it justice executed with intelligence, patience, and care. Some might expect bitterness, but there wasn't any, just satisfaction, calm, and the quiet knowledge that those who had tried to manipulate us would never underestimate me again. And in the end, as I looked at Lily's sleeping face, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in proving Dad and Tyler wrong. It was in proving to myself that I was capable of protecting what mattered most, and that nothing, not even a lifetime of entitlement and manipulation, could ever take that away.